Uh-oh, Daniel left the call
Daniel left. What's up, everybody? I'm Michael
on
Fielding with
stage.
the Free Academy. We're here today to discuss the idea of legitimacy as it applies to, say, government or authority, and just helping us determine, as humans, which kind of organizations do we feel are legitimate and which are illegitimate. So that kind of goes around this word, and I figured I might start off by just kind of reading the definition of legitimate. So according to Merriam-Webster, it is allowed according to rules or laws. Another definition is real, accepted, or official, and another definition is fair or reasonable. Um, so Tyler, would you want to start off by maybe talking about what the word legitimacy means to you?
Yeah, yeah. I guess I haven't given it much thought, but I think there's something to at least two parts of the definition that you just read, which is from Webster's or something.
Yeah, Merriam-Webster.
Yeah. So it seems like something could be legitimate um, in like an objective sense, and I think that that's what they were talking about as far as real, right? So like if you want to grant that sort of things can obtain outside of their being observed by some subject, then you could talk about some state of affairs or fact as being legitimate, like insofar as it's real, right? But I don't think that that's really the relevant part of the definition for the kind of discussion I am at least anticipating this little video conference to move toward. And so maybe the one that I want to try to focus on, or at least I'm going to be having an ear out for during the discussion, will be more like a subjective legitimacy, which is probably sort of, and of course I'm going to use the subjective objective uh, term distinction there kind of in a loose, in some sense, rough and ready way, but I think
Do
that
you want to
this
maybe go into that real quick? What exactly is the subjective objective distinction for listeners who
um
may not know?
yeah, so like something is objective. Well, like one way, I guess the rough and ready way that I'm trying to use them right now would be to say that something is objective just in case uh, it's being true, whether that be like a judgment which is supposed to refer you to some state of affairs in the world, or like the fact actually obtaining. So like whether or not a fact obtains or a judgment being true does not depend on what subjects of knowledge think about it. And then subjective, sort of like, I guess like the counter to that would be some judgment or which is true, or some fact which obtains only through subjects of knowledge, sort of like recognizing it. So maybe
Yeah, maybe
that's a
a quick
pretty,
example though would be helpful.
yeah. Well, that's actually the tough part, right? Because uh, you just want to be hypercritical of all your examples, but maybe something you could say like whether or not. So like if I drop the, like I have some scissors here,
Uh-huh.
right, and then I drop it and it goes to the ground. So like uh, maybe like our like epistemology, or like our scientific framework, which helps us understand that phenomenon. We have this force that we talk about called gravity, right? So um, whether or not gravity obtains, people would want to say, doesn't depend on whether or not we ever saw things falling to the center of some mass or something like that. They would
So
sort of
like it would
like,
do it even if nobody was watching kind of thing, or like you don't
yeah,
have to perceive it for it to be a real phenomenon.
right, right. But like again, notice how it gets really tricky, and you want to get
Uh-huh.
hypercritical with the examples, because like a lot of people would want to still probably make the case that well, you didn't come to discover gravity without some corresponding phenomenon that you could observe. And then like you can even get into like deeper metaphysics of like social constructions and where like people have these really sophisticated theories for how even something like gravity could still be I don't know, like idealistic or like socially constructed or something. So, but then in this case, like something subjective, right? Like if we're sticking with these lame examples, it would be like Coca-Cola is better than Pepsi, right? They're like, oh, that's merely subjective because it's just a preference. Like that claim isn't true for all parties, or it's not true regardless of whether or not someone was actually perceiving or like tasting Coke and Pepsi. So okay,
Yeah,
and
makes sense.
so now if we get like bring this back into legitimacy with respect to something like a government, or just to sort of like push our way towards that topic, it seems like we don't really care to talk about objective legitimacy. Maybe you could talk about it if that interests you, but I think that what most of us have in mind is some sort of legitimacy of the government, let's say, that um, comes through our recognizing it. So someone like John Searle always gives the example. He says, like a president, like Barack Obama wouldn't be the president if we all stopped not acknowledging his being the president, or something like that, right? So it seems like the government has a kind of legitimacy insofar as a whole body of people sort of acknowledges that, right? Just like what you talk about, Mike, with like money, right? Like we all we all recognize the value that money has, and so that's where its value comes from, right? It's not like in the paper, right? It comes through a complex social dynamics, and a big system of a big system of this economics that sort of always ties back to our interests and our lives that we live, and so on and so forth. So I would say that legitimacy is probably going to end up being something along those lines, like subjective, right? It's granted through like a network of people acknowledging some properties or other about some entity that they also are recognizing as actually being out there. So
So
we
kind of
recognize,
more
yeah,
basically, you could say that government is only able to govern through the authority of the governed.
something like that. That it's like I'm
Authority
granted to
granted.
it.
Hmm.
Yeah, but of course it can go astray, right? Because like this is the problem with like when governments become tyrannical or fascist, right? It's sort of maybe it started out as those people trying to grant a certain authority, but then like once the entity is up and running with its authority, it can sort of I don't know, step over its boundaries, or at least it can try to. And then I think it's going against certain things that the governed would
So
want
does
to
that make
acknowledge
that
about it.
government illegitimate when it crosses that border?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe that's the implication there, that it becomes illegitimate, and maybe that's a red flag for like a need to reform uh,
I mean, that
that
would be what I would
system.
think, that the moment that a government or any sort of like mafia or something that's controlling any region, it becomes illegitimate when it's having to use force when people aren't supporting that government anymore.
Yeah, man,
Yeah,
I
I
like it.
would totally agree with that. But
If
how do you distinguish force from, say, the implicit force of taxation or something, where implied by the law is the fact that if you refuse to pay, and if you refuse to pay the fines that will come if you don't pay your taxes, and then if you don't go to court when they ask you to come, eventually they're going to use force to arrest you
Yeah,
because
but
tax evasion.
what's your definition of force? Like, yeah, they'll come down and arrest you. Like, you're talking about force to take away free will. There's definitely other governments that use physical, like violent force. And while I think the U.S. government is getting more towards the side of physical violent force, we realize as a nation that's not okay, and that's why we're fighting back against it.
Well, do you think people are though? Because I don't know if that many people are refusing to pay taxes. So
Well,
I
I'm not
don't see
talking
them
about paying
fighting back.
taxes. I'm talking about physical violence. I don't think paying taxes is really that bad.
Well, I think it's that bad. So we definitely can have our own perspectives on, I guess, how valuable or
No, you
unvaluable
can't.
taxation is. But so I
I
guess
think
my
taxes sucks.
taxes are what?
I think paying taxes is really bad.
Really bad.
Not a big
Um,
fan.
That's a great reason.
so I guess the question is how physical or how apparent does the violence have to be before it makes the thing illegitimate in our eyes? So, for instance, the mafia, they actually do go around and break people's legs, and people know about that and they see the violence. Versus with taxation, I think it's a little bit more hidden, and like you're saying, we don't really see the people who are hurt by refusing to pay taxes. Maybe that's because they're locked away in cages and they're not given time on the news. But
I don't think people who pay taxes are like locked away in prison. I think they don't get a lot of the benefits that people who pay taxes do, and they might have further complications. But that'd be pretty extreme to lock someone away.
well, it happens. I looked at the statistics, and 2,000 people were arrested and put in jail last year for tax evasion.
In
And
the whole U.S.
right, so yeah, I mean, you could say 2,000 is a small number. To me, it's a big number of people who basically just didn't buy something. It'd be like putting somebody in jail for not buying McDonald's. Uh, just because they didn't want to purchase a service, they were thrown in jail.
Well,
So for me, that's
it's
physical
more like they're
violence.
eating at McDonald's and refusing to pay for the service because taxes benefit society. When you're part of a society, you have to put something back in, and that's kind of what taxes are.
So that's an interesting direction. You say there's an obligation to pay taxes um, because what? Because we live in the society and the money gets spent within the society? Is that
Yeah, I
what you're
mean, if
saying?
you take in the advantages of that society, you should put something back into it.
Well, what if you don't want to use
Well,
the
then you
government
shouldn't take
roads?
advantage of the society.
How is it taking advantage to just go about your daily life but not buy government services?
Well, you would have to live outside of society. You'd have to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is great. I didn't mean to push you. I think this is a great line of reasoning, and that's the real crux of the issue is and that's why I left to begin with. I thought when I left America that I should not live within the United States because I didn't want to pay the taxes and because I didn't want to fund the government. But then, so my perspective on the legitimacy of, living in an area is that you shouldn't have to. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't start like that because I don't like the word should. I would prefer to not be threatened with violence for not buying something. And I think the roads, the schools, the hospitals. If I don't want to pay for the government's version, I should have the. Man, I keep doing it. It's so easy to slip into the should using
Yeah,
the
dude,
word.
whatever. Like, yeah, I
Um,
mean,
Just spit it out.
I would
like the
prefer.
should,
Right.
like the should can come from a place of like necessity. It's like if you're trying to make the claim that something is actually the case, then
Yeah. Well.
it's like insofar as thought wants to get at
Mhm.
the way things really are, then one should think of something this way. So, I mean, I wouldn't trip about using the word.
Okay. Well, anyways, to me, it's like there's a violent monopoly that prevents any competition from McDonald's, and then they say you have to buy McDonald's because you're using it, but they're the ones preventing any other fast food chain from existing. Um,
So, what would be your alternative to McDonald's?
letting anyone who wants to build a business build one. Let anyone who wants to start a restaurant build it. Let
Well, what,
anyone
what,
who
what do you
wants to
mean by
build a
that?
hospital.
What do you mean by
I
that?
mean, okay, whatever government services the government does, just stop preventing competition and allow people to enter that market. So it's not the case that governments are the only ones who build roads because no one else can do it. It's
Well,
because they
how would that
prevent
work?
competition. Well, you just stop issuing threats of violence. Like, for instance, Metro in Houston, it's the only within the city, it's the only bus service. But that's not because nobody else wants to participate. That's because the government has threatened fines to anyone who tries to operate within the region. And then the fine, that doesn't sound like violence, but what makes somebody pay a fine is the ultimate threat that they will kidnap you, they'll arrest you. If you don't pay your fine long enough and you don't show up for court, they will, arrest you. They'll issue a warrant. So
Yeah.
it's actually violence that's preventing anyone else from operating a bus service within the city of Houston. So my solution is just to stop that violence. You don't have to create new buses. You just stop threatening people, and they will create the new bus companies by themselves. And I think same for protection, same for hospitals, same for education. If you just allow competition, competition will flood in. Is my
Could work.
guess.
Like it's an empirical question, you just have to find out. So I wonder, oh shit, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah. So it seems like the threat of violence is just it's it's ultimately like I don't mean to say a bluff wholeheartedly, but it's kind of like an ultimate bluff. It's saying like it's just our way of trying to give ourselves an incentive to uphold some sort of constitution that we lay down because we have faith in their principles, right? Just like what you were saying, you're like, I think that if we did this, this, and that, then this outcome would happen or something like that. So like I think that in the past, sort of when we make constitutions or something like that, I think that's ultimately what we have in mind. We have faith in those principles that they're going to work. And so maybe those scare tactics are a way of just trying to give us an incentive to uphold them, where we think upholding them would benefit us in the long run. But I think something along the lines of what you're thinking is right. But I'll put it maybe just a different way, as saying like, look, if you just took those scare tactics out of like the written constitution, then we would still have an incentive because like we would know that if it was ultimately going to fail, then it would fail. So like let's say that you had some sort of constitution laid down and you're like, all right, let's try to use these as rules of thumb to sort of get our society organized. Well, like it should be incentive enough to know that if it's actually going to be a failure, then it will fail, and that will probably be bad for us in the long run, and then that will push us to change things. So, I mean, I'm kind of with your line of thought, Mike.
Well, one thing I noticed that we've kind of talked about without defining very accurately is society, and like using the word we and like grouping ourselves together into these entities that again is subjective to start with. We have this idea that the kind of 310 million Americans ought to be grouped together for some reason, but that's something I'm skeptical of to begin with, and that's I think one of the reasons why and from my perspective, it's illegitimate for a society, so to speak, a group of people, to claim an individual as being a member of that group who doesn't want to be a member of that group. So, for instance, the United States of America claims me as a citizen, even though I have never signed up to be a part of this group, and I don't see myself as a member of this group. So that's another reason why I think these laws are illegitimate from my perspective, because I never joined that group. So I don't think the laws apply to me.
Michael, can I say something?
Yeah, go for it, Grant.
I think when you use the benefits of the state, I think you are signing up for that group in itself. So when you use public roads, when you use public benefits, you're kind of incorporated within the same state, hence giving them the reason to claim you.
Okay, I have an answer for that. So in Austin, I built a trampoline out in the forest. Now, if somebody came along and hopped on it, would I be able to threaten them unless they paid me for the use of my trampoline?
If you wanted to.
If I wanted to, okay. Well, I like that answer because clearly I can threaten anyone with violence and take their money, physically. But I guess the question is, would that be legitimate for me to, go up to somebody and say, "Hey, I saw you jumping on my trampoline. You didn't pay for that trampoline. You owe me $1." And they say, "Oh, I didn't know that. I don't think I owe you $1." And then I say, "Well, I'm going to take you and put you in my basement, and now you have to stay there for 6 months
Well,
because you
doesn't
broke my
the
law."
well, first of all, like, wouldn't that be when a person would get a trial, and then either they get a
Sure.
warning, and then the punishment has to fit the crime? So I think it would be a little bit extreme to imprison someone for $1.
Right. Well, I think it's a little extreme to imprison
And I
people
think that's where
for
it gets
selling
into the
drugs.
Along
illegitimacy of
that,
it.
along
We could
that
put,
line of
yeah.
logical reasoning, then couldn't you say that because the United States implemented slavery, that us as individuals are responsible? It's like we
For
were born
what?
into something. Well, like what Grant's saying, like we're born into something that we have no control over, and yet all of a sudden, because we're considered part of that entity, we're therefore responsible for that entity. So doesn't that, conceptually, that follows the same line of logic, huh?
Well, yes
Argument
and
to
no.
benefit from the resources.
Well,
Why
the
is
slaves
that? We
did
benefited from
benefit,
them
you know.
creating a foundation for living, and we're still part of the same concept, quote unquote.
Yeah,
The
Sean,
United
but
States.
yeah, so it's like Sean Megan probably isn't responsible for the slavery that happened in the 19th century.
Right.
I think that's
And
clear enough.
am I
But
responsible for the road? Like, the roads were built before I was even alive, so who am I supposed to pay for that? Like, why, why do I
Yeah.
owe
Why
somebody?
do you have to serve up your life, like the one life that you have, for these people because decisions were made before you were even around? I don't can't make sense of it.
It'd be like me in the forest, I carved out some trails, right? And then I saw people come and use the trails after me. Can I try to extract money from them because they used the trail I made? It doesn't seem legitimate to me, but then again, I like to let other people use my stuff, so I'm not
Or make
always
them responsible for upkeep of the trail because they've used the trail that you've blazed.
right. Like, yeah, maybe they never wanted that trail there to begin with. I think it'd be kind of crazy
They're
to try
just
to take money from them.
they're
yeah,
just using it because it's efficient.
yeah. So like I think that you could we could probably work something out like this. Like, look, clearly there are some cases where we want to say that we're not responsible for something, or hang on, maybe let me try this, right? Like something like
When you say
what Grant
responsible, do
was
you mean like fiscally or morally or
uh,
overall?
That's a
well,
great distinction to make right there.
so like maybe we can come back to that, but like I want to try to work out what I was thinking. So Grant, something along the lines of what you were saying, or what I took you to be suggesting, was something like, look, um, like maybe at a more baseline level, we say, look, none of us were consulted before being born. We just were kind of here one day. So there's a sense in which the indebtedness that we have to the people that came before us, which is a sort of a whole complex history and a vast sea of discourse and meaning and all this stuff, right, which situates how we make sense of the world. So like there's a sense in which our like indebtedness to the people that came before us can be acknowledged. We're like, yeah, okay, I would want to say that there's a sense in which I'm indebted to sort of like the language that I speak, or like the people before me for sort of developing the language that I speak, that I sometimes find to work to my benefit. I can have like cathartic sort of like releases of poetic poesis or something, like, and it's all made possible by language. Or I can I mean, I don't know, I can make judgments and have knowledge because of language and so on and so forth. But surely, just as is the case with anything else, right? There are like overstepping those boundaries, right? Like for someone to then say, okay, there's a sense in which you're existentially indebted to like your predecessors. Then I can make the leap and say, oh, well, like I'm gonna go and I'm gonna get $5 from you because I paved this track back to the trampoline, and so da 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 da. So I think that we can always work something out like that where we can have on the one hand something that we're willing to admit is like probably okay, but then on the other hand there's like some sort of like over exaggeration, some sort of like overstepping a boundary. And so I don't think that we totally have to do away with or like I don't think that we totally have to like estrange ourselves from everybody. Like we can just take it for granted that when we use the word we're just either referring to some particular group of people or just all people in general.
I've got another good example, like in regards to the state. So,
Sure.
say hypothetically we have children, and the U.S. government's in $19 trillion of debt and $42 trillion of unfunded liabilities. So that's the thing. Like we're talking about something that Grant's saying that we're on the hook for a positive thing, like the use of roads, because the roads helps us get places. But what about, say, like something negative, like they've clearly spent a lot of money that probably shouldn't be spent, and a lot of money, going overseas to war that, maybe not all of us agree with. Do you think the children should then, that therefore they're liable to pay these bills because of fiscal irresponsibility, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I obviously don't feel at all responsible for any debt that I didn't sign up for myself.
Well, yeah, $19 trillion too, like numbers, we'll never see in lifetimes.
Definitely. And then something that kind of goes along with that on the the negative end of what we were forced through, at least from my perspective, we were certainly, some of that money was buying bombs and bullets, stuff that I didn't want to buy, and it was also buying public schools, which from my perspective are actually detrimental to society. And so we have to talk about, that money being spent wasn't a good thing from my perspective, so I definitely don't feel responsible for paying for that. If anything, I feel the opposite, that I'm owed for all the time that I labored, that I was going unpaid. I was a slave laborer as a child. It was mainly writing on pieces of paper.
Product, when you were laboring, what was your what
pieces of paper with characters on them. It was really pointless, but they forced me to do it anyways.
Cotton would have been better, huh?
Yeah, and well, nobody ever accused the government of being smart. I'm sure they could have put my nimble hands to use if they tried harder, but instead they just wasted them.
No, they produced legitimacy for themselves, because a lot of people retroactively they talk about public school positively, and then therefore that reinforces the image of the state.
Right, definitely, and gets people used to following the authority and the legitimacy of, it's a government representative at the front of the class. So for 12 years we're very used to saying, oh, the government representative, the teacher who's employed by the government, they know the answer. They know what's the appropriate thing to do. They can tell me what I'm supposed to do. And even the kids who rebel, they are rebelling against, that sense of authority and the legitimacy. So I definitely think that's part of the reason so many people find the government as a legitimate entity. Yeah.
So you're talking about a teacher being a representative of the government, right?
From a child's perspective.
Of the community? I mean, I think there's a distinction, because I don't think teachers go to any government camps where they learn how to enslave our children.
Well, they do have to get licensed to teach at schools. So, in a sense, like, I know you don't we don't have to use those words, but yeah, they have to get licensed by the government in order to
Isn't that
spend.
more validation than licensing? I mean, yeah, it is a license, but it's validation that you're credible enough to teach, that you're not just some like
Or,
rando off the street.
or it's a credibility that you're not going to tell the kids that government is illegitimate, right? Would they? Do you think they would accredit any teacher who was going to tell children that like the state is illegitimate and they should not pay taxes, that they should not get licensed for anything? I think that's a big part of the reason they go through this accreditation process is to make sure they don't let any subversives into being teacher roles. So I don't think just because that there's accreditation, that doesn't prove that they're, um, effective teachers. It just proves that yeah, the government's limiting the supply of teachers in a certain way.
And the competition.
Right. Yeah.
But
So
aren't private schools competition? And public schools are there so like the poor doesn't slip through the cracks with their education because you're uneducated, then you're easier to control. And
or maybe if you're educated, you're easier to control. Education in quotes, also known as indoctrination.
no, education gave you the knowledge to write your book, which you're trying to sell, going
No
around.
way. I learned all that in spite of school.
You
if
learned writing in spite of school. You learned
Right, school
how.
held me back.
Okay.
If I wouldn't have wasted all my time there, I could have been writing more, and I could have been a better writer earlier, I believe.
Well, the education system is a different discussion and all. I do think the education system in America has gone a little haywire, and we're prepping people for factory work instead of actual like thinking, like you said. But I do think that the public education system isn't bad, and there are other there. If you don't like the public education, there are other things you can do. There are things like getting homeschooled, which is not like the best, but you can go to
Right, but
public school.
you can't choose to not pay for public schools because they're funded through tax money. So they
No.
exist even if they aren't meeting the needs of the community.
But an
Um,
educated society is just a better society to live in.
right, I would love to start educating society. I
But
think what they're
isn't
doing is indoctrination, it's not education. Unless it's student guided, then you're, taking what an adult wants the kid to learn and forcing it on them.
So are we talking about
And
the legitimacy of public schools right now? Is that what the subject is?
yeah, that's where we've gone off to. What's your idea on the subject, Grant?
I mean, what age do you become whenever it's your own choice and not your parents'? Because
What age
people
do
would
you
say
think?
18, really.
legitimately put you in
Yo,
school, right?
are you asking my opinion?
Yeah.
Uh, it would depend on the kid. I don't believe in numbers, age numbers as being the right way of deciding when a child should or might want to go to school. Whenever the kid tells you, that's when it's time to put them in somewhere. And that's, assuming we should even send them to a centralized location. There's a big movement towards unschooling, which is basically like doing nothing, so to speak, but you just let the kid explore the world as he wants to, he or her. And, as a parent, you can guide them in their interests. But yeah, I don't think we need this formal paradigm of a building where you go and you sit in a room and somebody tells you something and then they test you on it. I am totally open to the idea that of like free range child rearing, so what they call it these days. Just totally allowing your child freedom and seeing what they want to do. So
Yeah.
I don't have an answer on when a child should be sent to school.
So I sort of had the phone down for just a bit, and so I can't say that I know everything that y'all just said the last couple minutes. But I did just hear what you said at the end there, Mike, and so I just have a question. Maybe to give like an anecdote really quick. So like I feel like I got a whole lot out of my studies at the university, and I feel like a part of that is due to there being some, maybe it's rough sometimes, but there's a rough kind of structure in place, and there's like a tradition that you're kind of being molded into, and so like there's things like that going on. There's like these infrastructures all around, whether they be physical or kind of cultural.
Hmm.
And so like I feel like I got a lot out of that because like I felt like it sort of kept things contained, and I don't know, it just like afforded you a certain like it afforded you certain opportunities to grow in certain ways that structures like that let you grow. So do you think that it's bad in all cases to have that model, or do you think that we could benefit from those models and just have a like different way of like articulating them, or like a different way of going about them? Maybe that you.
Yeah, I am totally cool with there being different kind of education traditions that different people can go to if they're interested. For me personally, I'm great at learning on my own, so I think for the most part it's a waste of time for me to go to some kind of lecture type scenario or some kind of um, I don't know. I almost regret if a mentor teaches me something because I'm like, oh, I could have learned that on my own. Like, why did you have to tell me? It takes some of the fun out of it for me. But I
Yeah,
understand that other students are totally different, and I totally see a role for um, lectures type settings or mentorships and having
yeah,
somebody who's more experienced be at the front, guiding people. But I
yeah,
guess okay, the problems I do have with that model are one, the funding scheme. A lot of times these schools are funded through taxation, at least partially. Even even a public university where students are paying, they still get government money, and that gives them an unfair advantage in the marketplace, which prevents us from really evaluating whether or not they're meeting the needs of their customers. Because I think we have to
hmm,
remember, the customers are the students, and they're the ones whose needs should be met. And I think money would flow towards the places where they most effectively meet the needs of their customers, and away from institutions that aren't making their customers happy, aren't fulfilling their desires. And so, yeah, cutting out the taxation part, I think, would help us be able to evaluate each school more effectively, whether it's
yeah,
profiting because it's meeting desires or whether it's profiting because it's threatening people with jail.
yeah.
Um,
Oh,
and
okay.
yeah, that's about it.
Like I kind of want to nitpick on something that you said and just maybe ask you a question about it. You
Okay.
were talking about you saying like, look, like some you said something to the effect like you regret when a mentor teaches you something because you say, oh man, I could have learned that on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is it for you to learn on your own? Because it seems like what I understand by that is like a lot of searching the internet, maybe a lot of reading papers, maybe watching like YouTube, TED Talks, or someone
Mm-hmm.
giving a lecture or something. So,
Yeah,
um,
you're right. It's still
what do
somebody.
you mean to say that you learned something on your own, right? And then, like, at what point does it just come down to doing things from your room behind a computer screen versus going and listening to your favorite like scholar or something?
No, I guess that's a great question because, yeah, I'm still seeking out knowledge from other humans, whether it's in text form or video form or a podcast or a real life human. Um, Maybe it has to do with the motivation behind it and whether I really decided to, um, pursue this knowledge or whether somebody was kind of pushing it on me or, setting up a list of objectives for the semester,
Yeah.
so to speak, like where I didn't pick each of those objectives, somebody else picked it for me.
Yeah, or well, yeah, which and it seems like so like if you look at the case of like a college syllabus, like oftentimes that's just, it's like luck of the draw, right? There are various things that we can do to research like a professor and how and like what their line of research is, but it seems like maybe we're never going to be able to like be able to produce our own syllabus and sort of know what things we're actually interested in until we're exposed to like a myriad, or like until we're exposed to a whole bunch of things. But also, I think that what you're saying probably, and I would definitely agree with you here, like it's probably more like applicable to the public school system at like K through 12, right? Because it's a sort of, it's a way of like normalizing people into society and the
Right.
values that that are sort of upheld by whoever's funding those type of infrastructures. And so maybe this turns on, maybe what we want is for us to take more of an interest in like homeschooling and like parents sort of, right? And of course, like on a sort of on like on an aside, this would like require us all like in our cultures to rethink what like the family life is. But it seems like we would need more homeschooling, right? Like have like these like little clans instead of sending them off to one big normalizing like institution that is funded by the state, and instead you can have your parents being your mentors. And so I don't know, maybe that'd be a better start to keep it.
It's a normalizing institution, but we all turned out so different.
We're pretty similar.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, like we are. So, yeah, maybe you're right, because it seems like we always want to generalize the population. Like I find myself saying really pretentious things like people are very stupid and average for the most part. So I mean, I mean, Grant, maybe you have a point. Yeah. Okay. Go. Sorry.
Well, I think Sean was going to say it, and I had the similar thought that maybe instead of just homeschooling be the alternative, also just free market competing schools, whether they're a few people or, on the scales of hundreds or thousands, similar to school organizations today. But I think once the tax part is cut out, then and the requirements for certain curriculum, then we'll have just more freedom and more competition, and who knows which ones are going to be most effective. I have no idea how to run a school, but I think if there's more competition, there will be better alternatives available to parents and children.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's only about homeschooling.
Oh, sorry. I think it's a lot more efficient in regards to the times you live in, too, because, say, now in the 2000s, like us going to coding and programming school is probably, that would be super effective for the kids nowadays. But if you were to implement this idea of competitive schooling in like the 70s or the 80s, it would be an entirely different field. So it's very nimble and malleable as well. It's not, there's no set guide.
Yeah, that's
competition allows us to trim a lot of the fat, I guess.
I think that's a great point too, and because Tyler, you mentioned tradition earlier, and I agree. Sometimes that's effective because sometimes organizations do learn a really good way of interacting with one another, and you want to keep that in existence. But sometimes traditions hold us back, and especially when I keep harping on taxes, but I think that's what allows this ancient education paradigm to continue till today. Isn't because people are choosing to give their money there, it's because they're able to get their money regularly without any concerns about meeting the needs of their customers. Every school pretty much knows that they're going to get money next year, even if every single student was unhappy the entire year. Like, it's not up to the kids, it's not up to the parents. They just keep getting money, and that's how they continue to survive.
I think if you ask most teachers, they're very concerned with their customers and how they're going to turn out, or they all want to provide value to their students.
Yeah. So of course, all of these bad things that we're harping at are happening at a more fundamental and implicit level. Things that are happening like underneath our noses without us really knowing about it. And so, so I mean, like, you're right, Grant, because like if you went and asked any primary school teacher right now, they're gonna say, well, of course I'm interested in sort of like the well-being of my students, and I want them to be well off. And so I mean, like, we're not blaming like any one person in particular, right? That's and again, I think that this is the benefit of talking about a we, because it's like a really like who's all behind all of this stuff that we talk about. It's not anyone in particular, it's like no one and everyone, it's just kind of
Right.
it's just like
Yeah, well,
all of
that's the
us and
danger
sort of
in
what
we
happens and emerges
too.
from our like ways of relating.
I think that's the danger of using the word we too, and using the word society and saying things like, society agreed to follow these rules and we agreed to these punishments for these rules, because it's so easy to use those words without any one individual being able to disagree. You just say the word, you just say society agreed, and me as an individual, I can say, well, I didn't agree, and you can be like, yeah, but society agreed, and
The
it's just a
majority.
dead-end conversation, but you still get to claim that everyone's saying something.
Yeah, because like, what if we all start, right? Like, we have all of the, like a smorgasbord of like educational systems, and we're all like each one's peddling just a different kind of physics, and like we're peddling different histories or different, or like like this one's claiming P and this one's claiming not P, and they both think they're saying something true. Oh no, what are we gonna do?
Depends on what the outcome is that we're looking for. But real quick, I want to say, like, comment on what Grant said. I think he's totally right, dude. That, like, these teachers, I mean, for the most part, I would say that a lot of them want to help kids out, and that's why they get into that line of work. They're just not necessarily set up to prosper in that regard, because we're kids who have infinite imaginations. I mean, look at all of us. We all climb mountains. We've all sailed. We all have traveled the world. And all these teachers, the only tools they're given to help us out with is a room full of 15 to 20 desks and some pencils and paper. Like, there's only so much you can do for hungry to thrive and hungry to solve hungry problems and pressure, and there's only so much you can do in that respect, and that it ends up being what holds us back, I would say.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I
right.
don't
Like
think they're
PE is so
necessarily set
limited.
up to thrive and be the best that they can possibly be, if that makes any sense.
Yep, and that goes beyond the teacher.
Oh, but yeah, no, what you said too earlier, Tyler, I think is like you're right. Like, when we get to university level, our choices are we have a lot more choices than just we can go to trade school. Even when you do go to university, it's not like you have to be in classes that you don't necessarily like. Well,
I
there,
mean, you
there
still
still
kind
is a
of
little bit of
do.
that, but it's not near as bad as like
Like the GEs or something. Yeah.
junior high and stuff.
Sure, but okay, I mean,
So
I'm totally on board. You have more freedom at the university level, but when you think about it, my entire college career, I might have made, let's see, like 5 choices a year, basically, or 5 choices a semester on what classes I was going to take. So like 10 a year. Like, I made 40 decisions basically, and a lot of those were required. So maybe I made
right.
20
No,
decisions
I'm saying more
over
like
4 years about what to learn. It's nuts.
I mean, your first one
right.
was the biggest. Your
Right, and what did I know about computer science when I started? And then once I was a certain ways in, it was I was going to throw away basically $20,000 if I backtracked. So
Right.
you quickly get down a route that it may not be forced by violence, but you
Right.
start jumping through a bunch of hoops to like get the degree that you're supposedly going there for, and you
so
don't get
Right.
that many
I'm saying
options.
that, like, you can, like, there's more choice, like, because you don't have to go with university. Say you wanted to learn about computers, you could have gone to a coding boot camp that was 3 months long. I'm saying there's
Definitely.
more of a competition in the marketplace as opposed to like choices inside the university paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, I
Mike,
totally agree with that.
if I may, I mean, if you didn't
Yeah.
know what you wanted when you were 18, how is some junior high or whatever age kid you're arguing needs to get out of this government slave camp going to know what they need to learn?
Yeah.
Why do they need to pick one
Like, and
thing?
that's why we need like really good exemplars. I mean, like, I know it's an ideal thing to talk about, but yeah, I mean, it seems like like I'm of the opinion, like, I don't necessarily think that it's the design of the model, but it's not like the model. Maybe we should probably be out on mountainsides more often, like Sean was trying to suggest, and be out there and doing things and not so much in a desk and paper and all that. But like, I think that we need to look to older generations to guide us, and that's why it boils down to just having a bunch of virtuous agents out there. Like, you need to have good people in charge of that guidance, because otherwise it's just gonna, I don't know, maybe
Definitely.
end up in the bad.
Hey, maybe
in the
I could
bad
try to
thing.
pull that back around and back to the original thing of legitimacy, and how maybe looking for exemplars and kind of mentors out in the real world is kind of the practice of finding legitimate authorities. We talked about it being from a subjective basis, and how each of us kind of has the ability to find quality people and find people who we want to emulate. And in our eyes, what could be a more a better way of showing that you believe somebody's legitimate than by trying to learn from them. I don't know, trying to bring it back to the original topic. But I was thinking we should probably close it out pretty soon, because starting to get long. Does anybody have any closing ideas about school or legitimacy, I guess?
I think legitimacy is an individual basis. If one person thinks something's legitimate, then it's legitimate in my mind for the individual.
For them,
cool, I dig that answer.
Sean, do you have a comment or a question?
No, it was good to see Grant, man. I haven't seen Grant or heard him in a long time.
Heard him, yeah.
Well,
I have maybe one question about legitimacy that I was thinking that, like, we just kind of leave open-ended, like we don't have to go on with it, but just a question to throw out there. Can something, like, do we think that it's possible for something to be legitimate even though a group of people don't recognize it as being legitimate? So this is like the objective sense of legitimate that I mentioned at the start. What's the worth of something being objectively legitimate, and how do we go about determining whether or not it is?
Right, and we could, just to close, I think go back to the original definition, and in one sense of the word legitimate, it's allowed according to rules or laws. In that sense is kind of trying to be objective, and another sense is fair or reasonable, and in that sense is clearly subjective. But I think that's a great question to leave people with, because I certainly think some things are illegitimate that other people might think are legitimate, and how do we resolve those disputes is kind of like one of the key problems of life, I suppose. Yeah. But thank you all so much for being on the show. Grant, thanks especially for tuning in. Fun talking with you. Jennifer and Daniel, they left, but thank you guys. And if you want to follow the Free Academy, we're on freeacad.com. We also have a Facebook page, The Free Academy, and a Twitter @The Free Academy. And if you're interested in being on one of these discussions, they're a lot of fun, super informal and easy. So there's a subscribe list on freeacad.com where you can put your email address and you'll be alerted about future episodes. So until next time.
Real quick.
Yeah, go Sean.
We have we're like kind of merging this global book club that me and a friend made with the Free Acad as well too. So we'll start doing like a monthly book, roughly, and we're having the first podcast on the first book we read, which was Biocentrism by Robert Lanza, and we might actually have one retroactively about another book we read called The Tower of Babel, and it's about the Bank of International Settlements. So feel free to look into those, and we'll talk about them and post a podcast. But then going forward, we'll have a tab on the website so you can see what book's going on and when the next podcast about it is as well. So, yeah, hope to share some good with y'all and hope to hear about some good books from y'all.
Yeah, more examples of free education. I love it.
And the Free Academy is not all political, and it's not just a bunch of anarchists. So, so it's not like whatever. It just so happens to be that that's the current hegemonic paradigm. Not on my watch, though. So
right,
I'm not an anarchist, so
right. And Jennifer wasn't an anarchist, neither was Daniel. So pretty even split today. So I love it. And we love getting a variety of perspectives. So please, if we have any kind of topic, don't worry that people are going to team up against you or anything like that. We try really hard to have a roundtable discussion and respect everybody's ideas around these parts. Well, with that, I think we should go ahead and sign off. But thank you all so much again, and till next time, peace, love, and anarchy.
Yeah.
Free Academy.
No.